So we're back with Intro to Web Programming, Lesson 5. We've created our delete links with our handy JavaScript confirmation, and we've built a delete artist page, but it doesn't do anything. So before we took a break, we just outlined what we would need to do. And most of the code here is actually stuff we've already done. The one thing we haven't done is actually the first step, which is how do we read this value from our URL parameter? And then we want to store this number in an ID in a variable so that we can pass that variable to our delete command. So let's create a variable. We may as well call it artist ID. Now, when we were submitting forms, we used the post object to get values, the different values from our form. We're not using a form here, so we can't use post. So what collection should we use that will give us access to values that are appended onto our URL in this list? You got it. Remember, we said when we on our forms use get, the values wind up as URL parameters. So in this case, we're deliberately using get. So we won't get the parameter that's called artist ID, because that's what our link is passing. So this name here needs to match that element in the get array. So we could have multiple values, but we only have one. We don't need to pass anything else besides the ID. The rest of our code is pretty much what we've already been doing. Put in your credentials. What does our SQL statement look like? You guys would have done this last semester in your database class. I'm seeing a few nods, so how do we do it? You got it. So we'll use this artist ID parameter. So I'll put in a colon as a placeholder here. And then like we've done with our other database operations, we'll create a command object with our connection and our query. And then we need to fill the artist ID parameter. And it's going to be an integer. So we set up the parameter on line 17, and then we're filling it from our variable here. Take our artist ID variable and pass that value into the parameter with the same name. And our last two commands are pretty easy. Call execute. As Jillian said earlier, we'll just set the database null to disconnect. We'll leave the redirection out. We want to see if this code runs first. Because if it doesn't run, we'll want to see an error message on this page that'll help us fix it. So when we're deleting, typically we only ever pass in one parameter, which is the primary key value. That uniquely identifies the record we want to get rid of. We call delete, we execute the statement, and we're done. It is critical, however, we don't forget the where clause when we're deleting. If we just write the first part of our delete command and we execute it, we're going to delete all the records in our table. Yes, I've done it. Then I have to go and get my database back up and get the old table because I've just deleted everything that I had. Which is not a good idea. I don't recommend it. So delete should always have a where clause. Don't delete everything. Okay, well, let's try this. So I have a few. I've got this one here that says name. It will be readily identifiable. So if I click delete and click OK, I've got a blank screen, which is a good sign. It means we didn't get an error message. But now the question is, if I go back and refresh my list, right, that record's gone. So I know the delete is working. So the last thing we want to do is take the user back automatically to the artist list page. They shouldn't have to click refresh. Let's just take them there and the query runs again, and whatever record we deleted should have disappeared. So PHP has a weird function for doing this. We actually change the page headers. Hang on, I'm drawing a blank for a minute. Bear with me for a second, I'm drawing a blank. I think it's header. So we set the HTTP header we're changing the location of the HTTP header to redirect. I think this is how we want to do it. We'll try it out. If we have to modify it, we'll modify it. It would be simpler and more direct if we had a redirect function, but that function it doesn't exist in PHP. So we're changing the location of the HTTP header. We'll try this and see if it works. So I'll start deleting some of my blank ones. So it just takes us back. We never actually see the delete page. So there's our complete code. So deleting anything, we can almost use this code as it is. All we would really need to change is, if it was a different table, we'd change the name of the column. We'd change the table and column names in our SQL and our parameter name, and then we just change the name of the page we want to redirect to. Everything else here is going to be pretty much the same. And always a good idea to leave out the header location until we're confident the code is working properly. Add that in last, once we know our page is doing what we need it to do. We'll probably want to add this header location onto our save artist page as well. Right now, when we save a new artist, it just displays a message, says artist saved, and then the user's kind of stuck there. It would be better after adding an artist to take them to the list, and we'd see that new artist show up in the list automatically. So we'll probably want to add that same line of code on line 30 to our save page. We'll do that a bit later because we're going to make some other changes to our save page. So that's pretty much it for delete. Does anybody have questions about any of the things we're doing here? So I started with delete today because it's fairly simple, with the exception of adding our little JavaScript pop-up that made it a little more complicated. So now we've done 3 of the 4 CRUD operations. We can create, we can read, and our application can delete. The one thing we can't do is edit. So what should this process look like? What should we do in the browser, and how should the edit work, do you think? There's a few possibilities. What would make sense here? Where should the user go, and how should they be able to edit an artist? Okay. Okay. So we could like put edit buttons here, for example. Okay, so we could maybe even make the name a link, and if we click the name, and we could create a new page for this, but we probably don't really need to. We could repurpose we already have a form, so we could just load this form, but instead of giving the user a blank form, we can fill it with all of the existing information, and then the user could update it. So we could build an edit page, but not really necessary, or we already have this HTML that does what we need it to do. So let's just leverage this page. So we can do it on our list either way. We could add edit buttons here, or we could just make the name clickable. Maybe we'll make the name clickable. So you just click the link, and it'll take you to the form, and the form will be populated with the name, year, and website. So in our list, we want to add anchor tags around the name. So inside of my first column, we want the name to be a link that will go to, whoops, I guess the page is artist.php. But just like on our delete links, we need to pass in the ID. So when the form loads, we know which artist the user clicked on, so we can populate the page. We're going to add the same artist ID parameter. And then our end A tag is going to go at the end of the column. So before, the only thing we had in here was the value name. And we're now wrapping that artist name in an anchor tag. So our href tag starts here with a double quote. We've got some literal text. And I also missed an equal sign, sorry. So it's going to, every name is going to link to artist.php with an artist ID parameter, and we'll append the unique ID onto the end. And then we'll close our opening anchor tag, print out the artist name, and end our anchor tag. We don't need any kind of JavaScript confirmation. Users aren't deleting anything, so we don't need to give them a message saying, are you sure you want to edit this artist? That's just unnecessary and annoying for the users. We really don't need that confirmation if we're going to do delete. So now when we refresh, our names turn blue. They're going to the right page and they're passing in the ID. And now alternatively, we could have added another button and done our href on a button tag. If you did it that way, that's fine too, whatever you like. Making the name clickable is probably more efficient if this list is really long. It saves all the HTML of generating, 100 or 500 buttons on the page, which will make our page load more slowly if we've got a really big list. So our list is done. So now we're going to need to modify our artist page, because right now, every time our artist page loads, form's blank. So this page will now have two purposes. If we're adding a new artist, the form should be blank. But if we have an ID parameter being passed in, we need to populate the form with the existing values so the user could update them. So on our artist page, we need some logic, and it could go anywhere. We could put it inside the body, or we can even put it right at the top of the page. So we need to evaluate as soon as this page loads, are we adding a new artist or are we editing? And if we're editing, we have to go and do the work to pre-populate the form values. So the first thing I'm going to do is initialize variables for each field. We got year founded and website. So if we're adding, all of these values will stay null and our form is going to be empty. So what can we check? Are we going to know whether the user's adding a new artist or whether they clicked on an artist name and they want to edit? When this page loads, how do we know the difference? How can we tell when this page loads if the user wants to add a new record or edit an existing record? Right, we can evaluate if we have an artist ID value in the get parameter. If we have an ID number passed in the URL, the user's editing. If there's no artist ID, they must be adding. So if an ID parameter is passed in the URL, we are editing. So in this case, we'll do the same thing we did on our delete page. If there's an ID in the URL, stick it in a variable. So if we're editing, we need to go and look up this record to get all the values. What query do we need to write to get this one record with the selected ID? It would be similar to the query we wrote on delete, but a little bit different. Right. So we'll use the same where clause and parameter. Get all the columns from the artist table for this one record. We need a single bind param statement, the exact same code we've already used today. Fill the artist ID. Execute the query. Now in our artist list, we wrote almost this exact same code. We just don't have a where clause or a bind param. Let's just look at our query here for a minute. We're selecting, for array, I'm going to go keywords in all caps. And we called fetch all. We called fetch all here because potentially we're getting multiple records. And we need to use a loop to parse those records. In this case, we don't really need a loop. It'll work, but it's kind of unnecessary. It's extra code we don't need because we're only selecting one record. So we can use a slightly modified version. We don't need the fetch all command. We may have to modify this a bit so we can use fetch without a loop instead of fetch all with the loop, as we were only selecting a single record. So we'll try the fetch method here. We may have to play with it a little bit. But this should allow us just to populate a single artist rather than a list that we'd have to loop through. And now we should just be able to populate our variables from this single object. So the looping structure adds some performance overhead, which isn't really necessary. I said, we'll have to try this out. I'm not entirely sure I've got my syntax right here. We may need to add a parameter to the fetch command, but we'll try it. And then we'll disconnect. So we only need to do this when we have an artist ID parameter. If there's no artist ID, we don't need the database at all on this page. We're just going to give the user a blank form. I'm going to try this out in my browser just to see if it generates any sort of error. Okay, no error, but my form is still empty. So we need to do one more thing. Our code isn't complete here. What will we have to do? Because we haven't actually touched the HTML form down below. So what will we have to do if we don't want to populate the form for editing? Right. So in the name, we'll add value equals, and then I want to echo that name variable into the text box. And our inputs in HTML, there's no text property, we have a value property. So I'll try this for one of them and just see if it works. So now if I refresh. Okay. So we're populating the name. We need to do the same thing with our other two inputs as well. So on my year founded, we'll set the same value equals. We'll print some PHP tags here. And same. So I've initialized my variables to null because in the event we're adding, I don't want to get undefined errors when I'm trying to print these variables. So now it populates our form. So we've just added the value attributes to print our variables into the corresponding HTML controls. So it seems to work when we're editing. We should probably go back and make sure the form still loads properly if we want to add a new one where there's no ID. We want to make sure we haven't caused any errors with all the code we've added. So I'm just going to go back to my list page. And right up at the top, I've got this H1 tag. Before my PHP, I'm just going to put in a standard HTML link to the list page that says add a new artist. So it will load artist.php with no ID. So I want to make sure that my form still loads properly and is blank if I go to add a new artist and I have no artist ID. I'm just going to add this on my top of my artist list. So if I just refresh my list here, Now I have this little link that says add a new artist. So when there's no ID on the end, my form is blank, there's no errors. If I click on any artist, my form now fills. So we've dual purposed this same page. We can now use it for adding or for editing. When we have an ID, our form will be populated. If we have no ID, our form's blank. So this is the behavior we want. So if I go to edit an artist, say I change the year, what will happen when I go to save my artist? Right, it created, says saved, and if I refresh my list, I now have a new one. John, why did it create a new record? Right, our save page every time says if the data is valid, connect to the database and run an insert command. So we haven't written any code here to do an update. This page right now only adds new records. So we're going to need to add some more logic on here so that this doesn't happen. Go in, save again. I keep getting new ones each time. At least now I can delete the bad data because we've enabled delete. So we need a bit of logic. We have some logic on our form that tells us whether we're adding or editing. We need similar logic on the save page that's going to decide whether to run an insert command or an update command in the database so that we don't add the same record twice if we're just trying to do an update. So this code here needs to get wrapped in some kind of condition. How are we going to know what can we check on the save page that will tell us if we're inserting or updating? Right, so right now this page doesn't deal with, there's no mention of artist ID. If I search on this page, artist ID, we don't even find it. Because we built this page solely for the purposes of adding. We knew we didn't have an artist ID at this point when we created this page. So now we need to deal with it. So let's add artist ID. Where's that artist ID going to come from when we're updating? Let's look here for a minute. So I go in, click on this one, I edit something, I click save. Don't worry about that. Where's my artist ID? Is it in the URL? Right, we had the URL parameter here. Why does it disappear here? Right, how is which method are we using for our form, post or get? We're using post. When we use post, do we have any values? Do we have URL parameters with post? No. So right now we'll lose our ID. So somehow we need to include this ID somewhere in our form body. So when we submit the form, the artist ID is included in the post array. So how could we take this ID on this page and embed it somewhere in our form? So when the user posts the form, we still have access to that ID on the next page. How could we do that? So we can pass it from this page to this one using get, but we can't pass it from this page to this one using get, because we can only call one method at a time. And our form is already submitting with post. So we can't use post and get together. So somehow this value needs to get embedded into our form body. So it gets posted. How could you do it? Does the user need to see or change this value? No. So what kind of control could we put in our form where we could put this value in, but the user doesn't actually see it or modify it? Let's go back here. So I want to add into my form an input. We'll call it artist ID. We'll print the artist ID variable in here. What type could we change it to? So the value is included in the form. It's here, John. Yeah, if we set it to a hidden input, the value is included in the HTML, but it doesn't get rendered to the browser. I mean, the value isn't secret. The user can see it in the URL anyway, but we want to embed it in the form post along with the 3 other inputs. Sorry, I'll just resize this so you can. So I've added line 58. So now if I refresh my form, it looks identical. We don't see any new input, but if I view the source, here it is. It's okay that the user sees it. The point is that that value gets included with the new name, year, and website for purpose of doing an update. And if we're adding a new artist, when we're adding a new artist, it just has an empty value. That's fine. That's how it should be. We're adding a new record. We don't have an ID yet, so the ID is going to be empty. When we're editing, we're just basically copying the URL, copying the ID from the URL into our hidden field. So now we can access that ID in our save page, and then we can evaluate it and decide whether to insert or update. If we have no ID, we'll insert. If we have an ID, we'll update instead. So I've added this line 58 to my form. Doesn't really matter where it goes as long as it's in between the opening form tag on line 43 and the closing form tag on line 60, anywhere in there. Typically, we usually put hidden fields if we need them down at the bottom. Sometimes we might include other hidden fields. Let's say we're adding something like Google CAPTCHA code, which we'll do. We'll add later in the semester. We have to generate an API key with Google, and we don't need to show that value to the user, but we have to put it in our form as a hidden field in order to successfully call CAPTCHA. If we don't have an authorized Google key, it won't let us use the CAPTCHA API. So now on our save page, we can add that our artist ID variable gets filled from our artist ID element in the post array. Maybe it's got a number, maybe it's empty. So this has value when editing, empty when adding. And now we can evaluate artist ID. When it's empty, we'll insert. When it's not empty, we'll write an update command instead. So we'll go down to where our insert is. And now we'll need to wrap this in some logic. So I'll just indent it so I can nest it. If artist ID is empty, our SQL command will be insert. If artist ID isn't empty, we're going to use the same three parameters. For our update, we need a fourth parameter. What's the additional parameter we need when we're updating? How do we know what record to update? Yeah, we need a where clause. Without a where clause, we're going to update every record in the database. I've done this too. I had a client with an online bookstore. They had 600 books in the bookstore. They sent me an email and said, "Hey, Rich, can you update the price on this book to $19.99?" I was in a hurry. I opened up my query editor and I wrote the query update book set price equal to $19.99. Forgot the where clause. And I set the price of every book in the shop to $19.99, overwrote all the prices, immediately realized what I did, had to call the hosting company. They charged me $75 to go and retrieve a backup to overwrite the table. It was 3 hours of my life and $75 of my time because I was in too big of a rush to make sure I had a where clause on my update. So we will try not to make that mistake. So now we need one more if statement to deal with this. Because when we're updating, we need to fill that fourth parameter. When we're inserting, we don't have a fourth parameter, so we don't need to do anything else. So before we call execute, if we have an artist ID, we need to bind the fourth parameter. Only if we have an ID already. So there's a couple ways we could do this. We could say if not empty, artist ID, or we could use the opposite function of empty. In PHP, there's an is set function, meaning it has a value. It isn't empty. So if our artist ID has been set, we need to call bind param one more time. So we're always going to have the first three parameters. And if we have a value for artist ID, we need to bind a fourth parameter. If we're inserting, we have no ID, so we only need the first three up here. It's really important that whatever number of parameters are in our SQL query, we have the same number of bind param statements. Stella, we had a conversation about this earlier in the week. When we don't, if we have 3 parameters in our query and 4 bind param statements, Stella, do you remember the error message we get? We're all going to get it this semester. Right. If ever you get an error that says invalid number of tokens when you try to execute your query, that means the number of parameters in the SQL statement does not equal the number of bind param statements you have. So you might mean, I've got 3 parameters here, but I've tried to bind 4 parameters. It's going to fail. So whenever you see invalid number of tokens, you just need to count. How many parameters here that start with a colon and how many bind param commands do I have? And you'll typically find that number is not the same. So this code should be complete now. We'll try it. Hang in there, Mitchell. I know you're fading. Okay. So now I'm going to try, I need to try both my edit and my insert. So now if I go to edit, I'm hoping this time it'll just do an update rather than an insert. Okay, so my update works now. What about if I add a new artist? Did we break anything? This is the error we get. There we go. Number of variables does not match the number of tokens. So something, we've got 3 variables here. So this code, I guess my isSet isn't working. Maybe because we're setting it to null. I'll change that to not empty and see if that works instead. So I've changed line 64. I'll refresh and resubmit it. Okay, yeah. My isSet didn't return false as I wanted it to. So if artist ID isn't empty, bind the parameter. Yeah, because I assigned it null. Right. So I'm better off to check for empty instead. So now if I go back and refresh, my new artist got created. I don't really need this record. I'll delete it now. So now our page can both insert or update. So we have a full working application. Took us about 5 weeks to get here where we can create, read, update, and delete. Now, we didn't have to do this all on one page. We could have created a separate form for editing and a separate page to save and update. I find it's more efficient to just reuse the same pages we used for adding. If you want to create those separately, that's fine. The last thing I'm going to do here is rather than showing a message to the user, I want to add my redirect back to. Instead of showing them a message and leaving them stuck here, we'll just take them back to the updated list. So the user can see their new record or their changed record right away. We'll just add that down at the bottom. But we don't want to add that until we know our code is working. I'll try one more time. If I go and edit and save, now it just brings me right back here. which is better? So we can add, we can edit, we can delete. So it's 5 to 10. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break in a minute. I'm going to give you, I know assignment 1 is due next week. It's due on Thursday. Okay? You don't have to do edit and delete as part of assignment 1. You only have to do the create and read. Okay? I am going to give you a lab now for doing edit and delete. It won't be due until after next weekend. Okay, so you don't have to, I'll assign it. So if you have assignment 1 done and you want to get started on lab 2 while edit and delete is fresh in your mind, you can. But I'm making it due after the long weekend. Okay, so you have lots of time, you can leave it. Let me look. I'll give you the lab and I'll explain what I want to do for the last hour of class after we take a break. Let's go and have a look at the lab. I'll also upload all my code to Git in a minute if you need to reference it. You know what? I'll make it due the following Thursday. So you still have a week to do the lab, which is tons of time. The lab won't take that long. It's a little longer than lab 1, but rather than having to do it over the long weekend, that's a good, fair point. I'm a reasonable person. Thank you for suggesting it. Okay, so we'll make the lab due basically in 2 weeks on February the 20th. I will show you the requirements now. And then give me a minute to explain what I want to do with the remaining time after we take a break. So here's what you need to do for lab 2. Run this script in your database. This will create a table and insert some records in the table. So do this first. You then need to build a page that's much like lab 1. It'll be an HTML table that'll show all the teams, all the clubs, and all the grounds. Each one will have a link to edit and a link to delete. If you click edit, it should load a form where we can change the name or the ground or both and update the database. There should also be a delete link. When you click it, it pops up a little JavaScript window saying, are you sure? And if the user clicks OK, it should then delete the record from the table and refresh the list. So you don't need to add code for inserting. The insert is just done through the SQL command. So it's not necessary to write any code. That I can add a new club through here. And just create a new private repository, push, add me as a collaborator, and also include a link to your actual site, publish your site on AWS, give me a link to lab 2. So this won't take very long. You have 2 weeks. Do assignment 1 first, okay? If you're ahead on assignment 1, you want to get started on this, go ahead. If not, don't worry about this until after Family Day. That's fine, okay? I'm not asking you. So one thing is due before Family Day, and then you got several days after, so you don't have to work over the long weekend to get this done. One thing about this I should mention, notice every time we update, we're going to update all of the fields. We don't have to, but this is the most efficient way. Like, let's say we have 20 fields in our table. Why is it probably more efficient from a code perspective just to update all of the values, even if the user maybe only changes one of the values? Why are we better off to just update all of them? even the fields that don't change. Right. Or we'd have to track one field at a time. Is the new value the same as the old value, which adds a lot of extra work. It's not really necessary. There's one warning though. Occasionally you might build applications like this and your client is going to require that. So for example, I built an application years ago for the Ontario Federation of Snowmobile Clubs. It managed all of their equipment. Anybody here have a snowmobile pass? So it managed all their equipment across the province, and all that equipment had to be insured. And in the equipment table, there were like 30 fields. So the form was really long. But their insurance company said, anytime you change anything on a piece of equipment, you have to file a report telling us what got changed. So on the save page, before we would update the database, we'd have to go and compare all the original values to all of the new values. And we'd have to send them an email with a list of every single value that got changed. And they only wanted us to update anything that was different from the old value. And they would need to send that report to their insurance company every time somebody changed something on the equipment. So occasionally you'll get a client that has these requirements when you're updating. And that makes doing this much more work because you then have to track each field at a time. Is the value different? Or I've had to do it in another one where my client was publishing a book annually. So they wanted, the editor needed to be able to see what was different from the previous edition. So I would have to show them, here was the old version, here's the new version, then I have to highlight all the changes in yellow for them to approve any updates. So occasionally you'll have to do it and it's a lot of tedious work, but it does happen. Okay, we're going to take a break. I'm going to explain just before we do what I want to do when we come back. Some of you may want to stick around for it. If you don't, I'm not offended. Okay, we're done with the PHP part of this today. So create, read, update, and delete is done. Be sure you're here next week because we're going to start dealing with security and authentication, which is a huge responsibility. You can't go a day without reading about some major data breach in applications, right? And if our applications get breached, we get blamed. So we have to do our due diligence in trying to secure them. But the other thing I'm going to do with the rest of class today, which may interest some of you, and if it doesn't interest you, that's fine. It's kind of an optional thing, is I want to show you guys a few other, we did add Bootstrap to this last week. I would never pretend to be a good web designer. I'm terrible, but I try to make use of some of the tools that make design for developers a little bit easier. So we added Bootstrap, and I've put this up here in the lesson 5 folder. There's a design resources, which with a bunch of other links. So I'm going to show you how, if you're interested, how some of these tools work and how it will allow us to make our site, which we've started with Bootstrap, make it look a little bit better, a little more custom, and a little more polished using some of those tools. This may be of no interest to some of you, and if it's not, I take no offense. Have a nice weekend. If you want to learn how some of these tools work, then we'll take a break. We'll come back in 10 minutes, and around 10:15, I'll poke through some of these things, and I'll add a few more design elements to our page. If you're interested, stick around. If not, good luck on your assignment. I'll see you next week. Okay, I'll take a 10-minute pause here and I'll push what we've done up to GitHub.